Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 47th week of 2017. I'm Carl Estabrook. For more than a quarter century, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things on a Mercenaries edition of News from Neptune. I mentioned the mercenaries question that's come up in two interesting ways this week. The internal coup in Saudi Arabia, in which Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, has seized other powerful people in the kingdom and imprisoned them, produced a story this week that, in fact, these grandees, whose money apparently was being taken away by Mohammed bin Salman and his faction, were also being tortured by mercenaries brought into Saudi Arabia, and the first report was that they came from the Blackwater Group. The successor company that Eric Prince has followed on to his Blackwater operations, responsible for death and destruction throughout Iraq, for example, claim that they are not involved. But it is said that American mercenaries have been carrying out the torture, including the torture of major economic figures, major wealthy men in Saudi Arabia. The second area in which mercenaries turned up this week is far more murderous. It was grudgingly revealed by the United States that we have many more troops in Afghanistan than the Obama administration was willing to admit, and that number is being increased by thousands by the Trump administration. In a footnote to this revelation was the fact that there are twice as many mercenaries, we call them contractors, armed men working for the United States in Afghanistan, as there are regular troops. There are perhaps now somewhere in the neighborhood of 13,000 American troops, Special Operations Command and others, in Afghanistan, and 26,000 mercenaries, contractors. This operation in Afghanistan, a major crime in the century, the second only perhaps to the invasion of Iraq, continues apace with mercenaries making up the majority of the forces that the United States has committed to Afghanistan. In a well-run society, this would be a major scandal, and we would be talking about that. Instead, we're talking about the personal peccadillos of American government and media personalities. So, a Mercenaries edition of News from Neptune, and we'll begin with David Green. What's on your laundry list, David?
Well, first of all, in memoriam of Edward Herman, should be mentioned. Edward Herman, a prolific media critic, not just in his work with Noam Chomsky, but his work with himself and with other people over the many years since he began working with Chomsky. And I assume that he began working on this stuff before he met Chomsky. In the 1980s, they collaborated to publish, of course, the famous Manufacturing Consent, and then many other articles critiquing the manner in which the media covers, especially America's wars and America's crimes. He lived to be in his early 90s. He was from what I've read about him, especially an article by David Lindorf on the Counterpunch website, he was a rather eccentric character in some ways, but not, I mean, in rather modest ways, living a modest lifestyle and devoted to his criticism work. His background was actually as a professor of finance, if I understand that correctly. And I never quite understood what the relationship was there, except that just a relentless attention to detail, accompanied by a relentless attention to the hypocrisy in which details end up in the mainstream media.
Actually, the connection with the world of finance is interesting in a couple of ways. I don't know how central they are. Chomsky, who was our mentor for this program, Noam Chomsky has often argued that the best way to find out what's going on in the world is to read the business press, not the political press. Mm-hmm. That is, the Wall Street Journal, not in its editorial columns, of course, but in its news reporting, comes closer to giving a good account of what's going on than the New York Times does. The latter is a political paper, the former is a financial paper, and, says Chomsky, businessmen have to know what's going on. Well, there's something to that, and I think he may have got that, at least in part, from Edward Herman, mm-hmm. Who he always said was the principal author of mm-hmm. Manufacturing Consent, a major account of the media and how the media behaves from more than a generation ago. So, yes.
And whose name Chomsky insisted would come first, in spite of the alphabetical order, violating the rule of alphabetical order.
Right. That's right.
And so it's Manufacturing Consent is by Herman and Chomsky, not Chomsky and Herman, for whatever it's worth. I think one thing that's notable about Herman is that he continued on through the 90s, through the area of humanitarian warfare, Clintonian warfare, insisting and continuing to take unpopular positions that even Chomsky isn't quite as identified with as Herman himself was during those years, mainly vis-a-vis Bosnia and the whole narrative around genocide in Bosnia, mm-hmm. alleged genocide in Bosnia, and Rwanda in the 1990s, and the whole narrative around the genocide there and the relationship between the Hutus and Tutsis and how all that played out. He always managed to come up with an annoying, to many people, an annoyingly alternative narrative, never accepting the primary narrative of the humanitarian interventionists. So, and that got him in trouble with some people who consider themselves on the left, most notably George Monbiot of the what paper does he write for? The British newspaper,
the Guardian,
I
think. I think the Guardian.
Right?
Yeah.
Who writes good stuff, but never gave up the ghost when it comes to supporting, getting on board with the sort of those interventions that were in the 90s very much justified in the shadow of people's belated discovery of the Holocaust, of the Nazi Holocaust, and sort of relating these to never again type of narrative. Herman never accepted that understanding of what was going on in those countries, and as horrible as it was.
In retrospect, it's certainly important to realize that the American attack on Serbia, the American attack on former Yugoslavia in the Clinton administration, mm-hmm. Was one of the major crimes of the late 20th century and redolent of the stinking excuse that the United States and primarily the Clinton administration gave for humanitarian war, responsibility to protect, and so forth. These shameful accounts that depended upon lies about what was happening that the U.S. used for its imperial wars, even within Europe. The war against Serbia, which the Clinton administration undertook for reasons of opposition to the economic and social independence of Europe, was a lie from beginning to end. The Clinton administration said that it was attacking Serbia to protect the Kosovars. It never was. The point of the operation was the American and EU control of the European economy, and the justification that was offered was false. And Herman was one of the few, as you say, who pointed that out.
And his more frequent collaborator in recent years was a fellow named David Peterson. For what it's worth, you can find a lot of their work, of course, on the ZNet website. And I think I would also mention that we hear an echo of that just in the news in the last day, in terms of the trial of Ratko Mladic, the Serbian war criminal. And people asking in the New York Times, well, what took them 20 years to convict this obvious Adolf Hitler type character, implied, and of course, that always strikes a discordant note with me, because what's taken them so long to convict George W. Bush or Bill Clinton or anyone that should be on the dock at the International Criminal Court? It's become clear for quite some time that the choices of people who end up at the national, either they're black Africans or they're something to do with Yugoslavia or Serbia. It's a very narrow range of people who are deemed worthy of having killed the worthy victims that are defined in relation to Western interests.
It may be worthwhile to say just a word about this, because the Clinton administration's attack on the former Yugoslavia contained within it the basis of the more recent international crimes that American administrations have been responsible for. Remember that the Clinton administration could not get a United Nations justification for the attack on Serbia, even though they said, oh, we're doing this in order to protect these poor people in Kosovo. Everyone knew that was a lie, and the United Nations would not well, I wish everyone had known it was a lie. They didn't. But it was also clear that a United Nations authorization for a military action in Central Europe would not be forthcoming. So what the Clinton administration did was said, well, we'll use NATO for it. NATO, this combination of European states for mutual security, which of course had been a lie from the beginning. When NATO was founded after the Second World War, there was no chance that Russia was going to descend on Western Europe with its horse-drawn tanks and so forth, which was the case at the end of the war. But still in all, the U.S., in order to maintain control of Europe, which was what the primary point of American policy was, constructed this association of European states, which the U.S. always ran. The Clinton administration in 1999 turned to that to say, okay, well, it'll be NATO then that will be attacking Serbia because of all those nasty things the Serbs are doing. Well, it's a long story and a complicated story. The recent acquittal of Milosevic, the President Milosevic of Serbia, after his death, now is all forgotten,
Yeah.
but what's remembered is the U.S. use of NATO in its imperialist designs within Europe itself. And now, today, there are 5,000 NATO troops fighting in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is not, as you remember, part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a little far from the North Atlantic, but once again,
that hasn't stopped a lot of other countries from joining it. But
exactly. But well, back to Alexander the Great, you mean? Huh?
Yeah.
But the point here is that this is the propaganda excuse being used by the United States from the beginning of the assault on Afghanistan, an excuse that was crafted in Yugoslavia, in the former Yugoslavia, in Serbia.
So
I was looking for a point here that about the bombing of Yugoslavia from Noam Chomsky. He says we have in an interview a decade ago, Chomsky said, "We have for the first time a very authoritative comment from the highest level of the Clinton administration, which is something that one could have surmised before on the question of why the attack on Yugoslavia. This is from Strobe Talbot, who was in charge, who ran the Pentagon State Department Intelligence Joint Committee on the diplomacy during the whole affair, the whole attack on Yugoslavia in 1999, including the bombing." So that's from the top of the Clinton administration. He wrote the foreword to a book by his director of communications. Now, follow the plot. This is Strobe Talbot, who was one of the apparatchiki of the Clinton administration in its war in Yugoslavia. He wrote the foreword of a book by his director of communications, John Norris, and the foreword to the book, Talbot says, if you really want to understand what the thinking was of the Trump administration, this is the book you should read, and take a look at Norris's account of the real purpose of the war. It had nothing to do with the Kosovar Albanians, the people from the Kosovo region that Clinton said he was protecting by sending the bombers into Serbia. It was because Serbia was not carrying out the required social and economic reforms, meaning it was the last corner of Europe that had not subordinated itself to the U.S.-run neoliberal programs, so therefore it had to be eliminated. Now, in that sense, it completes the arc that begins with the formation of NATO, which the U.S. constructed after the Second World War in order to control the European economy. That was clear from the beginning. The rebuilding of the European economy was in aid of American capitalism, which needed customers. It was in aid of the control of the economic life of Western Europe and protection against the attraction, which was very great after the Second World War, of socialism. The long propaganda campaign by the U.S. to denigrate the Soviet Union depended on the very real fear that the United States would watch other states, particularly in Europe, succumb to the attraction of socialism. That had to be stopped. And the final act of this particular nefarious drama was the attack on Serbia, the attack on Yugoslavia in 1999 by the Clinton administration for fear that they were not down with the program. They had to be incorporated into the neoliberal construction, not yet quite neoliberal in 1999, but very clear about the direction in which it was going, and the independence of Yugoslav socialism, which goes back to the end of the Second World War, couldn't be allowed anymore at the end of the 20th century. So we had to kill some people. We did it.
Yes. Let me move on to another relatively minor point in the scheme of things. But very much related to what you were saying at the start of this program. We have even more to give thanks for the day after Thanksgiving. and that is that Thomas Friedman, our intrepid columnist from the New York Times, has paid a visit
Speaking of turkeys,
to the Saudi royal family. He has done an interview, an exclusive, private, personal interview with MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. A laudatory interview. I wouldn't think that I could be shocked by anything that Thomas Friedman ever writes, but I'm a little bit surprised that he thinks that he could sort of pull off, at this day and age, pull off this Friedman-esque interview where he cozies up to MBS and MBS cozies up to him and tells him that everything in Saudi Arabia is going to be okay. I'm loosening things up. We're entering at least the 19th century, if not the 21st century. We're gonna do things better here, and that this is a sign. Friedman has for a long time been on to this idea of a Sunni revival, and this has taken various forms throughout the years, his understanding of how this Sunni revival is going to take place in relation to Iraq or Egypt or whatever. But now apparently the Sunni, whereas nobody would have thought that the Sunni revival would be taking place in the heart of Wahhabi, do you say Wahhabi or
Wahhabi, I think.
Wahhabi Islam, which is obviously seen as the most fundamentalist and medieval. Well, you don't like when I say medievalist, but do you? Not medieval. That's not a good analogy. But the most primitive kind of Islamic. Intolerance towards women, towards all rooted, of course, in this fantastic wealth, all rooted in the access of this Saudi royal family's access to this wealth and what to do with it, how to use it, how to get it out of the country, how to control it, how to control the people, how to make sure that the other countries in its region don't impinge on their privileges within that region, of course, in subordination to the U.S. interests in the region. And as this has evolved towards this increasingly open alliance between Israel, between the Saudi royal family and Israel, whatever its similar and different interests might be in the region. In the midst of that, Friedman comes up with this idea that there's going to be a kind of Wahhabi-centered Sunni revival, and everything's going to be okay. And I have to say that even the commenters of the New York Times, which tend to be pretty gullible in a lot of ways, were, as far as I can tell, the few comments I read that were most highly supported, are not really buying this, are not buying this story. Good for them. I mean, it's the easiest story not to buy. It's just amazing that he would have the chutzpah to do what he's done. I'm talking about Friedman, as well as Mohammed bin Salman.
Yes.
The chutzpah to kidnap a leader of another country, get him to resign, meaning, of course, Lebanon, getting to resign. I mean, there's just a lot of chutzpah going around the Middle East this week,
David, I think you're absolutely right. I can't get over how equanimous the American press has been about what's going on in Saudi Arabia, and Friedman is just the icing on the cake here. But I mean, what Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, has done, I think is beginning to look more and more like a set of actions comparable to the Night of the Long Knives in 1930s Germany. In 1934, in Germany, there was a purge of the National Socialist German Workers' Party by the forces of Adolf Hitler, who took the leading members of that party and killed them.
Just to make it clear, what you're saying is he was killing people that were, in a sense, to the right of Adolf Hitler.
Well, it didn't. They were competitors for control within the National Socialist movement. The people that Mohammed bin Salman, I mean, all analogies limp, and this one may be more spavined than most of them.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is that we had an authoritarian political community eliminating internal opposition.
Sure.
What Mohammed bin Salman has done in the peculiar construction of the Saudi Arabian state is to attack the other powerful members of his generation, and according to the reports this week, not only imprison them, that's clear, that's what he's done, but also torture them. It's also reliably reported that he has insisted they give him their money. A substantial amount of the money controlled by this large group of Saudi princes and others have been the price of their eventual freedom, or so it's said, because they're not free; they're still imprisoned. But there's reports of torture even of the most important members of this group, are really quite remarkable, and makes it clearer that Mohammed bin Salman, who has at best a tenuous claim on the government, the present king, his father, is nuts and is demented, and the notion that Mohammed bin Salman is replacing him, in fact, if not in name, and he may do that as well, nevertheless, doesn't ignore the fact that he is eliminating all possible opposition to his succession to the kingship, and he's done it in apparently a brutal fashion. This is amazing, and as I say, it bears comparison with other internal coups, the most notable of which is the Rome Purge of 1934 in Germany.
Yeah, I was smiling as you were saying that, not at the torture stuff, but at I was thinking, what I was thinking while you were saying that was that in Thomas Friedman's column, this confiscation of wealth of other members of the Saudi royal family was presented as an anti-corruption measure. This is how you fight corruption, by making one person all that much richer.
Exactly. And there's no doubt, I mean, corruption, what does the word mean when you have what is essentially a ruling group that is controlling the economy of the country? The wealth of the country is in the hands of this group. Corruption becomes almost a technical violation within a kleptocracy that the country as a whole is.
Yeah, and I think that one thing added to this, very minor, is that whenever a young leader is involved, there's always a tendency to see this as an attractive person, as somehow somebody youthful. I mean, maybe I'm stretching it.
No, I think it's an interesting point.
Macron in France is the same way. It's like if you have the fact that Mohammed, that MBS is 32 rather than 81, makes a big difference in how he's presented, how his image is being promoted. I'm not sure if it's being successfully promoted as Macron in France was. But anyway, that's just a little. I hadn't even thought of that before. I'm just making this stuff up. But
well, it's an interesting point. Hitler was 43 years old at the time of the Rome Purge in 1934, and obviously people didn't know what was coming in European politics. But the National Socialist German Workers' Party had just emerged as a competitor, and not by any means the clear winner in the fight for power in post-war Germany, between the war, interwar Germany, the 1930s. He was an attractive young leader in the way that you're describing MBS, and that shouldn't be forgotten. I mean, the subsequent history makes us forget how attractive National Socialism seemed to be in the 1930s, not just in Germany, but in many other places as well. And the brilliance, in some ways, of Hitler was to use publicity, to use the modern means of communication as existed in the 1930s to polish this image. The image was very attractive around the world. and that was exactly the situation of an attractive leader eliminating opposition that fits the description, at least, of what's going on now in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
You're watching News from Neptune. There is a lot on our plate here, and one thing I would like to mention also goes back to this theme of leadership. I'm not quite sure leadership of the same sort, but perhaps closer than we might think of what we're talking about. And this comes from the movies, too. There was a long article by Anthony Lane, who I think is one of the most cogent movie reviewers writing these days. He writes for The New Yorker, and I haven't much love for The New Yorker and its recent politics, but Anthony Lane, who has been writing film criticism for The New Yorker for a long time, is very good. He's very smart. But he does an interestingly political article this week on the depiction of Winston Churchill in modern movies, and the attempt by some of the leading actors of the generation to embody Churchill. On the whole, he thinks the record isn't very good, but along the way there is this acceptance of the idea that Winston Churchill is a hero of the 20th century, the man who stood up to Hitler, the man who saved the world from Nazi oppression in the Second World War. Lane is too smart not to see some of the problems with this discussion, but for him it's filtered through what he's really interested in, the account of how this world historical figure is depicted on film. It raises a question, though, and one that I actually written a letter to Anthony Lane about, in which I said that the acceptance of the picture of Churchill that these movies start with is itself a mistake. It's quite wrong. And if anyone wants to challenge that criticism of Churchill the hero, I would suggest they read Nicholas Baker's book, Human Smoke, The Beginnings of World War II and the End of Civilization. This is an extremely important book. I think one of the most important books of contemporary history written in some times, because it challenges our popular view of the Second World War and of Winston Churchill as a hero. It argues essentially that the Second World War was not something that Britain and the U.S. were dragged into. It was, in fact, something they wanted. And that Churchill, far from being a hero of defense, was responsible for the wars breaking out and taking the course that it did. Now, that is such remarkable heresy in terms of our popular understanding of the Second World War that you need some justification for holding that view. Nicholson Baker gives you that. What he does is select from contemporary newspaper accounts, primarily newspaper, but also other media, newspaper accounts of the 1930s, a description of how the Second World War came about, drawn, as I say, from contemporary references, wildly at odds with our popular notion of the U.S. and Britain being attacked by a Hitlerian plan for world conquest. If we could have a better account of the Second World War, we might not be in quite the position we are now of using the Second World War, particularly this mythological view of the Second World War, as a basis for all American, for subsequent American imperialist wars. Yeah. Be interesting. I've often thought that in many political and social questions, the artists often get there first. And what Lane is talking about here is the difficulties with which the artists have had in giving us a good account of Winston Churchill, this primary figure of the Second World War. There may be something deeper at work here, and that is a mythology that needs finally to be attacked. I thought, as a side note, one of the interesting ways that's being done is by the HBO series, The Man in the High Castle.
Oh, yeah. I just, it's hard to imagine what our culture, what our educational system, what our media, what our whole propaganda system would even look like if we somehow didn't venerate World War II in this way. As well as many other wars. I mean, it wouldn't even be. It's like you'd have to revolt against everything, and it would just be. It would. I mean, it's hard to imagine what would have to happen before people could think that critically and that self-critically about our own culture. And it only emphasizes the point that all of this business about diversity and multiculturalism and tolerance and opposing hate and all this stuff are ways of avoiding these truths, are ways of sort of making nice with each other, and not addressing fundamental historical issues and fundamental sort of structural issues that continue to persist because they are of a different order as to whether we like each other or we treat people well or don't treat people well.
On the side note to this difficult and I think finally deeply buried argument, there are occasionally chinks in the armor, so to speak, of the received opinion, the account of the Second World War that we're talking about, and they often come in peculiar places. I'm thinking of a book by Patrick Buchanan, a paleo-conservative, if you really want to talk about political positions in the United States, very unfashionable indeed. Paleo-conservatism is a far cry from the neocons, opponents really of the neocons. Buchanan, although known as a right-winger, was a severe critic of the war in Iraq, a severe critic of the imperialist adventures of the United States in the Middle East, and although a defender of Richard Nixon, in whose administration he served and eventually ran for president himself, Buchanan has been a mordant critic of recent American international crimes. And 10 years ago now, he published a book entitled Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War. Subtitle, How Britain Lost Its Empire and the West Lost the World. Now, nobody read Pat's book. It's a pretty good book, but nobody read it because he did not fit the political position. He was not a liberal criticizing American warfare in Vietnam and afterwards. He was a conservative in the American sense, who had served, as I say, in the Nixon administration, and was here criticizing the fundamental mythology that justifies American war making in the modern world. So nobody read him. Nobody got it. Nobody talked to him about it, and it disappeared without a trace. I'm probably one of the few people who actually read the bloody book, and it has its problems. There's no question about that. But it was a line of argument that criticized this overwhelming myth of the American crusade to save the world that was the Second World War. That's completely wrong. That's not what it was. That's not what happened. And to get the history right, as Nicholson Baker and to some extent here Pat Buchanan do, is an important propedeutic to the understanding of contemporary American politics.
I think of World War II as being this increasingly stressed, like pole holding up the history since then. I mean, this sort of this virtuous pole with all these weak links leading to the present in terms of all of the much more blatantly revealed American imperial adventures since then, most notably, of course, Vietnam, but Iraq as well. So it's hard to see World War II has to do a lot of work to sustain itself, and it's really not fair to World War II. It's not fair to the veterans of World War II, the few of them left who are held up as sort of being the fount of the last century of American virtue. That it isn't fair to them and to their experience. At whatever personal level, whatever political level they relate to that, it's not fair to them to have to be sort of become symbols or archetypes of a mistaken understanding of what their country was doing at that time. It doesn't reflect poorly on any soldier to have fought in a war. To have fought in this war, in terms of the fact that they were doing what they thought was the right thing, what their government told them was the right thing, what their culture told them was the right thing, and what for many of them was the right thing was because the World War II released an incredible amount of energy that had been bottled up during the 1930s for people who were idle. For youth who thought they had a very dim future in the economy as it existed at that time. So their participation was over-determined by so many of these factors, but that's no reason, of course, for them, those that are left, or their children or grandchildren, not to reflect more honestly on their ancestors' experiences in that war and try to kind of sort these things out without necessarily reflecting personally. Which, of course, and I mention that because that's what is being done relentlessly in the News Gazette for that war and for other wars, to kind of sanitize the political nature of those wars with the personal nature of those wars.
If people learnt an accurate history of World War II, they would begin by learning that, of course, the U.S. did not win the Second World War in Europe. The Russians did. The U.S. was not damaged by the Second World War, as all other major countries, winners and losers, were damaged by the Second World War. And they would learn, in the third place, they would learn that the American leadership, the Roosevelt administration, and the deep state of the U.S. circa 1940, wanted the war, wanted American participation into the war, in spite of the fundamental and the deep anti-war sentiment of the American people, because they knew it was the only way to solve the Depression. The Depression had not been solved by the administrations of the New Deal. Certainly they did some good and helped some people in the depths of the Great Depression, but the Great Depression didn't go away, and indeed it got worse in 1937. And by this time, the American government the Roosevelt administration had decided that only participation in the coming war could possibly do the sorts of things in organizing the society and unleashing those energies you're talking about that would restore the profitability of American capitalism, particularly if the control of the rest of the world was then given to the United States capitalist class, as indeed it was, and only that would allow the economy that was so stalled in the American 1930s to resume. Well, it all came true. It worked. But when we talk about what the U.S. did in World War II, we have to understand the primary purpose of World War II from the point of view of American leadership was to restore the economy, to restore their profits. And indeed they did.
Yeah. And of course, the important things to understand at a more prosaic level out of World War II was Bretton Woods and the the financial agreements that were being processed during the war, that the post-war world was being planned as the American hegemon in terms of finance, which culminated in the Bretton Woods Agreement, which set the nature of currency and global finance, and that really is fundamental, more than the violence, or as much as the violence. The globalized financial agreements that were precursors, that for 30 years were the precursors to the neoliberal era, which we're always going on about on this program.
We've talked about the background of American war, and it might be worthwhile to say a word about the present state of American war, which, remarkably enough, the American government is able to hide from most Americans. If you ask most Americans about what sort of war the U.S. is carrying on right now, they would say, well, isn't there something in the Middle East? I mean, not very important, is it? The fact the U.S. is carrying on 8 wars around the world, and that the U.S. has 70,000 members of the Special Operations Command, that's 70,000 members of the Special Operations Command of these elite troops in the American military establishment, distributed into 3/4 of the countries of the world. This is not known by most Americans. The U.S. is sponsoring the near genocidal war that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is carrying on against Yemen. We have a comment from our friend Kathy Kelly, Voices for Creative Nonviolence in Chicago this week. She says, I'm grateful for the group's planning nonviolent resistance, outrage, education, action to stop the war in Yemen. Years ago, in 1999, Iraqi teenagers helped me gain a sense of perspective about criminal behavior. War is always a crime, close quote. And that's true enough and recognized enough, people are not fools, by people around the world, that the genius of the last administration in this country was to hide, essentially, the war-making from the American public, to distract the American public from the war-making that was going on around the world. They were very good at it. The interesting thing about the current administration is the current administration is not so good at it. That people are beginning to understand that indeed we do have 40,000 troops in Afghanistan in the longest war that the United States has ever fought. We do have troops around the world killing people with everything from drones to conventional warfare, and that more and more Americans are at least unsure as to why this warfare should be carried on. This is something I think should be encouraged. But the interesting thing that the American war-making has on its side right now is a complete colonization of the American media, mainstream media. Someone sent me a note this week about the Washington Post, the CIA's favorite newspaper. The Washington Post lies about what's going on in Syria. Here I quote, the Washington Post claimed that U.S. officials were considering a potential open-ended military commitment in northern Syria after defeating the terrorists. Washington fears that the northern states, the northern part of Syria, where its troops have been training local militia, will fall into the control of the Syrian government, while an open-ended U.S. military presence may help stabilize communities under a local government. Well, that is that's such a lie, basically, from beginning to end, that you have to begin with the fact that the war in Syria began when the U.S. decided to support jihadist fighters, Wahhabi fighters, in the sense that you're talking about, from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Qatar, to overthrow the government in Damascus, because that government was allied to America's bête noire, Iran, and that government therefore had to fall. President Assad had to go, as Barack Obama said. 3 points about the passage I just read from the Washington Post. First of all, the U.S. never defeated the terrorists in Syria. The Russian, Hezbollah, Iran, Syrian coalition defeated those terrorists. Those terrorists were the ones that the Obama administration had sent into Syria and pretended to be then opposing. The U.S. armed and abetted the terrorists from the beginning, from 2011. Two, the northern areas that the Washington Post was talking about, illegally occupied by the U.S. The U.S. had no legal right to be in Syria, and so those northern areas were a part of Syria where the U.S. did not have rights. They already belonged to Syria. They're sovereign Syrian territory, and the U.S. Had no justification for being there from the UN or any other international reason, back to Bill Clinton using NATO to attack Yugoslavia. The American lies about what its military was doing continued in the same vein. Third, the Washington Post claims that the American presence, the illegal American military presence in Syria, was to stabilize communities. The U.S. was never there to stabilize communities. The U.S. was there to overthrow the government in Damascus. 16 years in Afghanistan and 14 years in Iraq show that stabilization of communities was never the issue. What the issue was the control of these oil-producing regions as part of the general American policy of controlling energy resources in the Middle East. It's a tissue of lies from beginning to end, not just the history, but the current news that one reads in the Washington Post. Under these circumstances, it's very hard to have a clear idea. It's very hard for Americans to get a clear idea of what their government is doing and why. As Noam Chomsky says, people don't only not know what's going on. Not only do not know what's going on, they do not know that they do not know what's going on.
That's the only instance in which Noam Chomsky begins to sound like Donald Rumsfeld. But anyway, to footnote that, I think some of the journalists who've been the most relentless in exposing some of these lies about Syria are Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton, a couple of young 30-something journalists. If I'm not even sure if Ben Norton is 30, maybe I assume he is.
Nobody's that young.
Yeah, but they actually have recently produced a podcast as well as their writings at the Alternate Gray Zone and at their own websites. And their podcast is called Moderate Rebels, playing off of the notion that it was these moderate rebels who we should have been supporting all along, that we didn't support fast enough to get them on their feet so that they could overthrow the Assad government before these jihadist groups took over the movement, this whole narrative. And they produced about, I think, 9 or 10 podcasts in the last few months, a couple every month. They've interviewed Gareth Porter quite extensively about his research on these matters, and they've related their own research. They're very well produced and very, very fast-moving, articulate podcasts, about an hour plus long, which I have found extremely informative recently. Also, I would add that they produced a podcast with the Palestinian-American scholar Joseph Massad, who teaches at Columbia, who is not as well known as some of his colleagues like Rashid Khalidi, but who is quite a perceptive observer. And they did about an hour-long interview with Massad, Ben Norton, and Max Blumenthal, which was about as good a concise understanding of the origins of Zionism, the kind of nationalist, sort of racialist origins of Zionism in the 1800s, in the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century, and sort of bringing various arguments up upon these complicated relationships between Zionism and anti-Semitism that I think for those who, I think this is old hat for many of us who have been researching this for many years. But for those who don't know it and who are discovering for the first time that there is this relationship between anti-Semites supporting Israel, supporting the Zionist project, which is being redounded upon to Steve Bannon recently. Yeah. Maybe you have a comment on that.
Yeah,
but in any event, anybody who wants to be informed in a rather concise way on these matters might want to listen to this podcast. Again, that's Moderate Rebels. Maxwell, I forget which episode it is, but they're not hard to find.
That raises in a roundabout way the important question we've been talking about this week of net neutrality. And I think this is an important issue, and luckily a lot of other people, I think, are coming to that same conclusion and are addressing their congressional representatives on the point. I thought one of the most interesting addresses came from Julian Assange of the WikiLeaks group, who wrote to President Trump in regard to net neutrality as follows this week. He says, "Dear President Trump, net neutrality of some form is important. Your opponents control most internet companies. Without neutrality, they can make your tweets load slowly, CNN load fast, and infest everyone's phones with their ads. Be careful." Close quote. Well, you may wonder about the irony of the WikiLeaks head memorializing Donald Trump on this matter, but remember, during the campaign, Trump praised WikiLeaks for the truth that it was getting out about the behavior of the Obama-Clinton administration. Yeah. So, it's not time for this hackneyed, strange bedfellows line, which is being used for other things in American politics these days. But it is worthwhile to note that this net neutrality issue is quite serious, and that the important changes in American politics in the last year and two that many people have ascribed to the internet, to net neutrality, to the fact that people's sources of information are not just mainstream media, that this suggests just how important this decision is.
Yeah, it's hard for me to understand in a certain way what, I'm sure I'm going to be able to still get to the websites that I'm used to getting to, Google the topics I'm used to, but I can see, at least to a certain extent, it's like when you Google something, you tend to look at the first page,
yes, right.
and not dig
deep.
They
count on that.
Unless you're really relentless about something, and sometimes I have to dig pretty deep to find an alternative point of view for a question I might have. But in any that is an important issue. Just one last thing was also in relation to the strange bedfellows. I think that Paul J. did a nice hour-long live at the time interview with Larry Wilkerson about the Syria issue on the Real News Network, in which I think Wilkerson, who's a sort of interesting guy, but knows a lot because he was an insider, has a lot of interesting things to say, and it is every bit as much as adamant about the kind of things you've been saying about our involvement in Syria from the very start as anyone else.
We've got to talk about Paul J. Dr. No has sent some strange comments on Russiagate in the Real News these days, but we're out of time for today. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 47th week of 2017, presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Ethan Young, and Andrew Scollery, with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson for research. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.